They set me up on a blind date with a single mom, but my answer left the entire table speechless. The night my friends set me up on a date with a woman they thought would be the punchline, I learned an ugly truth about people I'd known for years. They didn't think they were being cruel. That was the worst part. Cruel people who know they're cruel are easier to understand. My friends, on the other hand, thought they were just being funny, clever, maybe a little bold. The kind of grown adults who still believe humiliation is harmless as long as everyone finishes laughing before dessert arrives. My name is Daniel Marsh. I'm 35, single, and apparently lonely enough that my friends decided my dating life had become public property. It all started with what I was told was a group dinner. At least, that's what I believed. On Thursday afternoon, my friend Seth texted me. Saturday, 7 p.m., Bower and Pine. No excuses. I'm dragging you out of that cave. I replied that my cave had Wi-Fi, great coffee, and no strangers. He answered, exactly the problem. Seth and I had been friends since college. Back then, he was funny in the harmless way broke 20-year-olds usually are loud, immature, but easy to forgive. By 35, the loud part had survived. The harmless part had developed occasional defects. His wife, Priya, organized everything. That should have been my first warning. Priya was the kind of person who said, I have an idea. With the same confidence most people reserve for, I have evidence. She loved social experiments, playing matchmaker, and secretly recording people's reactions for the group chat nobody had ever agreed to participate in. Still, I went. Bower and Pine was one of those trendy restaurants with low-hanging pendant lights, tiny portions on oversized plates, and chairs clearly designed by someone who had never sat through a long conversation. When I arrived, Seth and Priya were already there with two other couples, seated around a long table. One chair sat empty beside mine. That was the first sign. The second was Seth's face. He was trying far too hard to look like he didn't know something. I stopped beside the table. What are you up to? Nothing, he answered a little too quickly. Priya smiled. We invited one more person. Who? A date? She said, lifting the last word like it was somehow a question. I stared at her. You invited me to a blind date? With an audience? Seth lifted his wine glass. Think of it as emotional cardio. I'd rather get hit by a bicycle. One of the guys at the other end of the table, Greg, laughed much louder than the joke deserved. Third sign. The fourth came when Priya leaned across the table and said, just keep an open mind. Some sentences sound polite until you hear the trap hidden underneath them. Before I could ask another question, the hostess approached with a woman walking beside her. She looked about 32, maybe 33. Warm brown skin. Dark hair gathered into a loose bun at the back of her neck. A navy-wrapped dress that somehow looked simple, elegant, and practical all at once. The kind of effortless style that immediately made me trust her taste more than anyone else's at the table. She carried a small purse, a denim jacket draped over one arm, and wore the calm exhaustion of someone who had already accomplished 3 difficult things that day without anyone in this restaurant ever noticing. Our table fell silent. Not ordinary silence. That small, ugly silence people create when they're waiting to see whether someone else's discomfort will become entertainment. Priya stood with a smile that was much too bright. Nina, so glad you made it. The woman, Nina, returned a polite smile. Hi. Then her eyes met mine. I stood, not because I was trying to impress anyone, because everyone else remained seated, and something inside me suddenly wanted to restore a little balance to the room. Daniel, I said, offering my hand. Nina Reyes. Her handshake was warm and confident. A tiny dinosaur sticker peeked out from the back of her phone case. I noticed it because Seth noticed it too. The corner of his mouth twitched. That was when I understood. Not everything, but enough. We sat down. Nina took the empty chair beside me, and Priya immediately launched into the kind of introduction that sounded friendly, if you ignored every blade hidden beneath the words. Daniel manages commercial construction projects, Priya said. Steady, dependable, and apparently allergic to dating apps. Nina smiled faintly. Sounds like a reasonable allergy. And Nina, Priya continued, is a mom. There it was. Not that she was a nurse. Not that she ran a small meal prep business, which I wouldn't learn until later. Not as a person with hobbies, a personality, a history, or a life. Just a mom, presented like a test. Nina's fingers tightened around her water glass for the briefest moment. I noticed. I also noticed Greg glance at Seth. I turned to Nina. How old is your son? Her eyes sharpened just a little, as though she were deciding whether the question was safe. 6. What's his name? Marco. And the dinosaur? I nodded toward the sticker on her phone case. She looked down before meeting my eyes again. Triceratops. He's in that phase. Solid choice. I nodded thoughtfully. Underrated dinosaur. For the first time, her smile reached her eyes. You have opinions about dinosaurs? Oh, plenty. I shrugged. Most of them are controversial. Seth groaned. Oh no. Don't encourage him. I ignored him. Nina tilted her head. All right. What's your most controversial dinosaur opinion? Velociraptors are wildly overrated. She laughed. Not the polite kind. A real laugh. And that was the exact moment the room lost control of its little joke. For the next 20 minutes, I talked to Nina as if she were exactly what she was. A woman sitting beside me at dinner. Not a warning label. Not a charity project. Not a punchline carrying a handbag. She ran a weekend meal prep business out of a rented commercial kitchen. She'd started it after leaving a restaurant that kept scheduling her for late-night shifts despite knowing she had a young son at home. She made lemon chicken people fought over. She hated cilantro. And she'd once spent 40 minutes negotiating with Marco over why pancakes couldn't legally qualify as dinner 4 nights in a row. I don't see the problem, I said. Flour, eggs, milk. That's basically civilization. Nina stared at me with exaggerated horror. You're dangerous. I've been called worse on construction sites. Across the table, Priya's smile started looking strained. Good. Then Greg spoke. There was always a Greg. He leaned back in his chair with a grin. Come on, Daniel. Be honest. He gestured toward Nina. You really ready to be a stepdad? Or is this just dinner? The table froze. Nina lowered her eyes. Nothing dramatic. Just enough. And I knew she'd heard versions of that question before. Different words. Same ugly shape. I set my napkin on the table. Slowly. Then I looked at Greg. No. The room went completely silent. Beside me, Nina didn't move. Greg lifted an eyebrow, looking as though he'd just scored a point. Before that silence had a chance to turn cruel, I continued. I'm not ready to become anything after knowing someone for 15 minutes. I held his gaze. But I am ready to stop sitting at a table where a group of grown adults invites a woman to dinner just to see whether I'll treat her life like baggage. The silence changed. This time, it carried weight. Priya's face went pale. Seth looked at me as if I'd broken the rules of a game he'd never admitted we were playing. I stood and turned to Nina. Would you like to get coffee somewhere else? Her eyes lifted to mine. There was surprise in them. But there was caution, too. The smart kind. I don't need anyone to rescue me, she said quietly. I know. I held her gaze. I'm just asking if you'd like better company. For 1 second, nobody breathed. Then Nina picked up her jacket, stood, and said, Yes, I'd like that. And just like that, the joke walked out of the restaurant with us. We left Bauer and Pine without looking back. Nina stopped at the hostess stand to thank the hostess. I held the door open. She stepped into the cool Saturday night, slipped on her denim jacket, and let out a slow breath that sounded as though it had been trapped behind her ribs since the moment she'd walked into the restaurant. For a while, neither of us spoke. The city was loud enough to let silence exist comfortably. Finally, Nina looked at me. You really didn't know. I didn't. She studied my face, as if she still wasn't entirely convinced. I couldn't blame her. I knew it was some kind of setup. I admitted. I just didn't know it was that kind. Her mouth tightened. Priya told me you were shy. She looked down at the sidewalk. She said you were kind. She said you'd be willing to keep an open mind. There it was again. That phrase, I never said that. She nodded slowly. But the bruise was already there. Not a fresh wound. More like an old bruise someone had pressed by accident. And then laughed as though nothing had happened. A cafe 2 blocks away was still open, the kind of place that survived because college students and exhausted adults shared the same dependence on caffeine. We wandered there without really deciding to. Inside, it smelled like espresso, cinnamon, and burnt hope. Nina ordered tea. I ordered black coffee. She noticed. Black coffee at almost 9 o'clock? I make bad decisions with confidence. She smiled. Apparently not all of them. I didn't answer that. We took a table by the window, far enough from everyone else to feel private, public enough to feel safe. I respected the choice. I also noticed she'd picked the seat facing the entrance. You always do that? I asked. What? Sit where you can see the door. Her eyebrows rose. You noticed? My job mostly involves spotting expensive problems before everyone else admits they exist. That sounds depressing. It pays well. She smiled into her tea. A few moments later, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then closed her eyes for a second. Priya? I guessed. The group chat. She turned the phone toward me. A message from Seth. Okay. Things got a little intense. Nobody meant anything by it. Daniel, you made everything weird. Then one from Priya. Nina, I'm sorry if that made you uncomfortable. I honestly just thought you two might be a good match. Nina pulled the phone back and laid it face down on the table. If that made you uncomfortable, she repeated. That sentence should be illegal. It's remarkably popular with people who don't actually want to apologize. She looked at me for a long moment. Then, more gently, she asked, Do you want to reply? No. I shook my head. You've had enough people speaking for you tonight. The words settled between us. I could see it. Nina stared out the window for a long moment before speaking, almost too quietly to hear. I almost didn't come. What made you change your mind? She looked down into her tea. Marco's with his grandmother tonight, and Priya made it sound so normal. She gave a small, humorless laugh. She said you were shy, that you'd just gotten out of a relationship, that you were kind. She paused. I told myself it was just dinner. Just gotten out of a relationship. Not true. It had been 2 years. Shy, unfortunately accurate, kind. I hesitated. Nina looked at me. Still under review? Exactly. She stirred her tea despite there being nothing left to stir. Marco's father left before he turned 2, she said. There wasn't some dramatic explosion. He just faded. Fewer phone calls. Less child support. More excuses. Then one day I realized I was spending more energy trying to make him act like a father than I was raising the child who actually needed me. I stayed quiet. She wasn't telling the story to earn sympathy. She was placing a fact on the table to see whether I'd handle it with care. So now, she continued, dating feels like a strange interview where men either act like I'm asking them to sign adoption papers before the appetizers arrive, or they compliment me for being so strong like they're complimenting a bridge that's barely still standing. That sounds exhausting. It is. She looked at me. But the worst ones are the men who think they're being generous just for considering me. That sentence deserves silence. So I gave it silence. Then I said, for what it's worth, I've never thought asking you to get coffee after escaping a table full of idiots was an act of generosity. No. She looked at me over the rim of her cup. It was me, improving my evening. This time, the smile stayed. We sat there until her tea went cold. And my coffee became a terrible idea. I drank it anyway. Then, Nina's phone buzzed again. This time, she looked at the screen, and her whole face changed. Not fear. Fatigue. What is it? I asked. She turned the screen toward me. Priya. Nina, please don't make this into a big deal. You know dating is harder for someone in your situation. And I was only trying to help. I read it twice. The cafe suddenly felt smaller. Nina took the phone back before I could say anything. No, she whispered. Not to me. To herself. I watched her type a reply. Delete it. Start another. Delete that one too. Finally, she locked the screen and placed the phone face down. I hate that part of me still wants to explain why that hurt. You don't have to explain it to me. Her eyes lifted. For the first time that night, she looked less guarded and simply tired. Then she asked, Would you walk me to my car? I stood immediately. Of course. The night had grown colder. We walked side by side toward the parking lot behind the restaurant. We didn't touch. We didn't hurry. When we reached her car, she stopped, but she didn't unlock it. Instead, she turned to me. I need to ask you something. I need an honest answer. Okay. If Marco had been there tonight, her voice stayed steady. Her eyes didn't. Would you still have stood up? I looked at her. At the little dinosaur sticker on the back of her phone, at the woman who had walked into a room built for cruelty and somehow walked out with every ounce of her dignity intact. And I realized she wasn't asking me about tonight. She was asking the only question that had ever really mattered. Yes, I said without hesitation. That was the moment Nina finally stopped trying to hold back her tears. She didn't sob. Somehow, that made it worse. She turned toward her car, one hand covering her mouth, her shoulders rigid as if years of habit were trying to keep every sound trapped inside her chest. I didn't touch her. That mattered. Not because I didn't want to comfort her, but because I'd known her for less than 2 hours, and the last thing she needed was another man deciding what her pain required from him. So I stood beside her in the parking lot, close enough that she wasn't alone, far enough that she still had room to breathe. After a minute, she wiped her face with the heel of her hand and let out an embarrassed little laugh. "I'm sorry." "No." She looked at me. "I hate crying in parking lots. I think most parking lots don't deserve that level of emotional complexity." A tiny laugh escaped her. Then she studied me. "You answer awfully fast." "I guess I do." "Because of Marco?" "Because if he'd been there tonight," I kept my voice quiet, "he would have watched a room full of adults treat his mother like something that needed explaining." I paused. No child should have to see that, and wonder whether loving their mom somehow makes her harder to love. Nina stared at me. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her entire face softened instantly. "Marco?" I asked. She nodded. "I have to take this." I stepped back. "I'll give you some space." "No, it's okay." She answered the call. "Hey, buddy." Her whole voice changed. Not fake, not sugary, just warmer. I watched her become someone's safe place in real time. It hit me harder than I expected. "No, Mommy's not home yet. I'm by the car." A pause. "What did Grandma say?" Another pause. "Marco. Toothpaste isn't glue." Another. "And triceratopses don't need emergency dental work." I looked away so I wouldn't laugh. She caught me trying not to smile, and fought back one of her own. When she hung up, she shook her head with exhausted affection. "The dinosaur lost a horn. Let me guess. Marco tried to glue it back on, with toothpaste. Structurally, that's not ideal." She blinked. "What?" "Painter's tape works much better for temporary dinosaur injuries. It leaves less residue. Not a permanent repair, but it'll hold." She stared at me as if I'd just revealed classified information. "You have opinions about dinosaur repair?" "I work in construction." I shrugged. "Different materials. Same emotional stakes." This time she laughed, really laughed. And inside that laughter, the night changed again. Not fixed, not easy, just alive. Then her phone buzzed again. Not a call, a text. Her smile disappeared before I ever saw the screen. She turned the phone toward me. Someone had taken a photo inside the restaurant as we were leaving. My hand was on the door. Nina was just turning her head. The picture itself was completely harmless. The caption wasn't. "Looks like Daniel passed the single mom test." For 1 second, I felt the kind of anger that makes your whole body go cold. Nina looked at the message. Then she did something I never expected. She didn't cry. She didn't hand me the phone. She opened the chat, typed 1 sentence, and hit send before hesitation had a chance to soften it. "I wasn't a test. I'm a woman. Don't text me again tonight." Then she muted the conversation. I looked at her. She was breathing a little too fast, but her chin never wavered. "Good," I said. "No." She shook her head. "I should have said it a long time ago." I nodded once. Nina glanced down at her phone, then back up at me. "I run my meal prep service tomorrow morning. Commercial kitchen on Ashland. 6 to 10. It's loud, not glamorous. And I'll smell like garlic for the rest of the day." I waited. It's also the place where I feel the most like myself. I understood what she was offering. Not love. Not yet. A second chance to meet her somewhere no one had arranged as a joke. "I'd like to stop by," I said. "You don't have to." "I know." She grew serious. "If tonight was simply you doing the right thing in a bad situation, let it stay that. You don't owe me anything afterward." "I don't want to come because I owe you." I smiled. "I want to come because you laughed at my dinosaur opinions, because you built your own business, because you just exited a group chat more gracefully than anyone I've ever met, and because I still don't know whether your lemon chicken deserves all that confidence." Despite herself, she smiled. "And what if it does? Then I'll need evidence." She unlocked her car. Before climbing in, she looked back at me. "Daniel." "Yeah? Thank you for what you said back there. You don't have to thank me for not being cruel." "No." She held my eyes. "But I can thank you for being right." Then she drove away. I stood in the parking lot until her taillights disappeared around the corner. My phone buzzed. "Seth. Dude, Priya's crying. You made everyone feel awful." I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed back, "No, you did." For the first time that night, I realized the date hadn't really ended. It had only just been allowed to begin. The next morning I arrived at the kitchen at 6:12. I carried 2 coffees, a roll of painter's tape, and the strange feeling that I was about to be judged by a 6-year-old I'd never met. Nina opened the back door wearing jeans, a flour-dusted apron, and a messy bun that looked assembled sometime before sunrise. Her eyes landed on the coffee first, then the tape, then me. "You brought tape. Temporary dinosaur injuries deserve a proper treatment plan." The corner of her mouth twitched. "And the coffee? Medium oat milk latte. 1 pump of vanilla. I guessed based on the tea, your hatred of cilantro, and your general suspicion of unnecessary bitterness." She looked at me a beat longer than necessary, then stepped aside. "That's either impressive or mildly alarming. I'll accept either." The kitchen looked nothing like the restaurant from the night before. No dim lighting, no tiny plates, no carefully curated atmosphere, just stainless steel counters, stacks of plastic containers, trays of roasted vegetables, rows of labeled sauces, the smell of garlic, lemon, and warm bread. A whiteboard covered with weekend orders, mostly family meals. Nina moved through that kitchen completely differently than she'd moved through the restaurant. At Bauer and Pine, she'd been prepared. Here, she was in command. Not loudly, not dramatically, just efficiently, confidently, like someone who knew exactly where everything belonged. "So this is your empire?" I asked. She smiled without looking up. "This is the least competitive 4-hour rental window between a bakery and a woman who makes gluten-free dog cookies. It's a brutal ecosystem." She handed me a hairnet. I stared at it. "This is going to ruin my image." She finally looked up. "What image?" "That's right. For the next 2 hours, I labeled containers, snapped on lids, packed delivery bags, and discovered that Nina's lemon chicken absolutely deserved every bit of confidence she'd had in it. She kept me busy, but she never made me feel useless. That told me more about her than any first date ever could. Around 8:30, the back door opened. A woman in her 60s walked in holding the hand of a little boy with serious eyes, a dinosaur backpack, and a triceratops missing 1 horn. Nina's whole face changed. "Marco." The little boy ran to her, and she knelt to meet him. Not in the cinematic way. In the mother way, 1 arm wrapped around his back. The other automatically checked his jacket zipper, smoothed his hair, and adjusted the backpack strap that had slipped off his shoulder. Hundreds of tiny acts of care, practiced until they'd become instinct. The older woman smiled at me. "So, you're Daniel." I stood a little straighter. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Elena, Nina's mother." She sized me up with surprising warmth. Marco looked at me with the uncompromising suspicion only 6-year-olds possess. "Are you the construction guy?" "I manage construction projects." Slightly less dramatic. "My dinosaur is broken." "I heard." He held up the triceratops. "Grandma said toothpaste isn't glue." "Grandma's right." Nina watched the exchange without saying a word. I reached into my bag and pulled out the roll of painter's tape. Then I crouched down, leaving enough space between Marco and me for him to choose. "May I?" Marco studied me like a building inspector. Then he handed me the dinosaur. I taped the horn back on carefully enough to matter, and carelessly enough that it still looked temporary. "There." I handed it back. Not permanent, but sturdy. Marco turned it over in his hands. Then he looked up at me. "Mom says sturdy is good." I glanced at Nina. Her eyes were softer than I expected. "Your mom's right," I said. Marco nodded once and ran over to the corner table where Elena had already opened a coloring book. "Crisis resolved." I smiled. Structurally speaking, Nina turned away a little too quickly and busied herself with shipping labels. I stepped beside her. "You okay?" "I'm fine." That sounded like the professional version. She pressed a lid onto another container. "He likes you, mostly because of the tape." "No." She glanced toward Marco before looking back at me. "He doesn't hand broken things to strangers that quickly." The words settled quietly into the room and changed something neither of us tried to name. By 10 o'clock, every order was packed. Every counter had been wiped clean. And Nina looked like someone who had already lived an entire day before most people had finished breakfast. Elena took Marco out to the car. Then, halfway across the parking lot, he turned around and ran back. He stopped in front of me. "Are you coming to the park?" Nina froze. Elena suddenly became very interested in looking somewhere else. I looked at Nina, not Marco. That mattered. That's your mom's decision, I said. Marco turned to her. Mom, can he come? Nina held my gaze for a long moment. I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Not because she didn't want me there, because every single parent knows the cost of letting someone step into the part of life that belongs to their child before they've earned more than one good morning together. I think, she said carefully, Daniel probably has plans already. I can change them, I said. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, not as a warning, as a test. Can you? Yes. Why? I could have said because Marco asked. I could have said because I liked her. Both were true. Neither was enough. Because I want to know who you are on an ordinary morning, I said. Not just who you are in a bad room. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The park, she said. 1 hour. Nothing more. 1 hour's enough. This isn't a date. I know. Marco pumped his fist into the air like he'd just negotiated an international peace treaty. At the park, I pushed swings, answered 6 separate dinosaur questions, and watched Nina relax 1 careful inch at a time in ways I wasn't sure she even noticed herself. She laughed when Marco insisted I play the volcano in an astonishingly complicated dinosaur migration game. At one point, she took a picture, then immediately looked embarrassed that she had. By the end of the hour, Marco ran over to Elena. Nina and I stood together along the walking path, her arms loosely folded, sunlight catching the flower that still dusted one sleeve of her jacket. You're good with him, she said. He's a good kid. That's not what I meant. The cautious part of her was still there. I respected it more every time I saw it. I don't introduce men to my son. Not like this. I know. And I don't want you thinking one nice morning at the park means you understand my life. No. She almost looked irritated by how quickly I agreed. So what do you want, Daniel? A real date. You choose the place. No setups. No audience. No one deciding what either of us has to prove. She looked at me for a long time. The caution was still there, but something behind it had shifted. Friday, she said. Dinner. Somewhere with normal chairs. Normal chairs. I smiled. Got it. And Daniel, yeah? If this becomes something real, it becomes real slowly. I nodded. Slow is good. She studied me one last time. Then she smiled. Not the polite smile from the restaurant. Not the exhausted smile from the parking lot. This one was smaller, warmer, and dangerous in an entirely different way. Good, she said. Then don't make me regret trusting you. Friday arrived with rain. Nina chose the restaurant, a small family-owned Italian place with normal chairs, warm bread, and no one from my social circle within a comfortable radius. She arrived 5 minutes late, wearing a black dress beneath her denim jacket, her hair down this time. I stood as she approached. She looked at me. You don't have to do that every time. I know. Then why do it? Because I want to. She studied me again, as though she was still deciding whether consistency was genuine, or just another performance. Then she sat down. The date wasn't perfect. That's exactly why it mattered. There were pauses, careful ones. Nina checked her phone twice because Marco had a cough. I asked far too many construction-related questions about the restaurant's ceiling because nerves were making me alarmingly unprofessional. She told me I had inspection eyes. It wasn't meant as a compliment. Halfway through dinner, she set down her glass. I need to be honest. I put my fork down. She looked me straight in the eye. I like you. She exhaled. That sounds terrible. It sounds painful. It is. The corner of her mouth lifted, then disappeared again. But I have a son. I have a business. I have a life that's already asked a great deal of me. I don't have room for a man who wants to feel noble for 3 weeks, and then disappears the moment real life gets boring. I understand. No, she said gently. You understand the sentence. You don't understand my schedule. Then she showed it to me. School drop-offs, commercial kitchen hours, sick days, canceled orders, birthday parties, budget spreadsheets, the guilt of working too late, the guilt of not working enough, the way dating sometimes costs more than hope. Sometimes it costs babysitting money. Sometimes it costs explaining to a 6-year-old why someone stopped showing up. When she finished, she looked exhausted. So, don't make room for me, I said. Her expression changed. I continued before she could misunderstand. Not yet. Don't rearrange your life. Don't move anything. Let me show up where there's already space. And if I earn more than that, then we can talk. Nina blinked. Then a tiny smile appeared. That's a good answer. I was aiming for useful. Useful is underrated. So we went slowly, exactly the way she'd asked. A second date without Marco. A third. Coffee after Saturday kitchen shifts. Then, an afternoon at the park, when Marco asked whether I knew how to build a bridge for toy dinosaurs. I took the question more seriously than most client proposals. Nina watched me with her son. Not romantically, carefully. That mattered too. Trust didn't arrive like fireworks. It arrived like evidence. Repeated over and over again. The group chat died within a week. Seth apologized badly, then apologized better after I stopped responding to his jokes. Priya sent Nina a long message. Nina read it, waited 2 days, then replied with 3 sentences. She accepted the apology. She didn't make herself available for their guilt, and she'd decide later whether she wanted them back in her life. Boundaries aren't always slammed doors. Sometimes they're locks installed quietly. Mother's Day came a month later. Nina had 27 brunch boxes to deliver. A school craft project. Marco had hidden so well she eventually found glitter in the refrigerator, and a headache she kept insisting was just stress. I showed up at 6 in the morning, carrying 2 coffees, breakfast tacos, and no flowers. She'd once told me flowers felt like another chore, one that slowly died where you could watch it happen. Instead, I brought a small toolbox. While she packed orders, I fixed the loose shelf in the kitchen. Marco made me a paper badge that read, Dinosaur Assistant. Nina looked at the badge, then at me. You know this isn't glamorous, right? I looked around. Food containers, coffee, a 6-year-old coloring at the prep table, a woman holding an entire life together with labels, timers, and stubborn love. No, I said, it's better than glamorous. That was the first time she kissed me, not in front of Marco. Not as a reward. Out in the hallway behind the kitchen, after the orders were loaded, while her hands still smelled like garlic and lemon, she stepped closer, looked at me as though she was deciding whether courage was worth it. Then she said, slow doesn't mean never. And she kissed me, gentle enough to feel careful, deep enough to make every bit of that caution worth waiting for. A year later, Marco introduced me to his teacher as Mom's Daniel, not my mom's boyfriend. Not my stepdad, not the construction guy, just Mom's Daniel. Nina heard him. She cried in the car afterward, then threatened to deny it forever if I ever told anyone. 2 years later, we moved into a little house with a backyard big enough for Marco to build an elaborate dinosaur excavation site, and for Nina to grow herbs she kept forgetting to water. 3 years later, I proposed at our kitchen table after Mother's Day dinner. Marco had proudly and spectacularly helped with the cooking. I didn't ask to become Marco's father. That wasn't something I had the right to ask for. Instead, I looked at Nina and asked if she wanted me to keep choosing the life we'd built together. The busy mornings, the impossible schedules, the lemon chicken, the toy dinosaurs, the woman who had walked out of a cruel restaurant and still found a way to trust me. She said yes. Then Marco asked if that meant I was officially allowed to fix things around the house without asking first. Nina answered, absolutely not. That's when I knew we were a family. Years later, whenever people ask how we met, Nina says, his friends made a terrible decision. And I say, it was the worst and somehow the most useful decision they ever made. But the truth is even simpler than that. They tried to turn her into a joke. She became my home. What would you have done if your friends had set you up on a blind date with a single mom as a joke and everyone expected you to treat her life like baggage? If you're watching this around Mother's Day, take a moment to appreciate the mothers in your life. Share a story about your mom or a single mother you admire in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.